Hello, I am Julie Nash, the moderator for today's webinar on climate transition plans within the food sector. I'm the Senior Program Director of the Food and Forest team at Ceres. Before we start with today's session, I just have a few notes on logistics. First, this session will be recorded, and we will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after the presentation is done. We will also be sending out the webinar presentation to all participants. We will not be taking live Q&A, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we will address them either within the presentation or the time today or after the presentation. In addition, if you have a technical question, such as trouble with audio, please also type that into the Q&A box and we'll try to sort it out for you. So first, I just want to be able to thank everyone for participating in today's event. And I'm especially grateful to both Nako and Matt for joining us and sharing their views and experiences on climate transition plans. Nako is the manager of the Food and Forest team at Ceres. She is the lead author of the Climate Transition Plan report, which we'll be talking about today. At Ceres, she develops thought leadership on climate transition plan and leads our work on Food Emissions 50. She holds a master's in food, agriculture, and the environment from Tufts. Matt Silvera is the manager of environmental sustainability at the Hershey's company. And you can see that with his background today. Matt's responsible for Hershey's overall strategy and implementation of their science-based targets and advancing sustainability within both their facilities and their global supply chain. So we really welcome him today. So if you turn to the next slide. If you'll turn to the next slide for the agenda, thank you. So I just wanted to be able to highlight today's agenda. So we're going to have Nako Kobayashi be able to outline the key recommendations that are within the report, the Investor Guide to Climate Transition Plans in the US food sector. And then Matt and I will have a conversation about transition planning in practice. So if you'll move to the next slide, I will turn it over to Nako.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks everyone for being here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Before I get started, I do want to note that an integral part of our discussion today is the role that natural and working lands play in mitigating climate change. And so I would like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous peoples in the US and globally who have stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. We do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, and including through our work. So with that, I would like to begin our presentation today. I'll be talking, as Julie said, about our new report that we're really excited to introduce everyone to, the Investor Guide to Climate Transition Plans in the US food sector. And I will be focusing in on some of the examples that we found within corporate public disclosures on some of the ways companies are thinking about this and how disclosures could be clarified. I have packed a ton into these slides, and so Julie mentioned that we'll be sharing these with you after the webinar along with the recording in case you need to reference them. And we definitely want to encourage you to download the report and email me for any questions that you might have. So next slide, please. So we developed this report at Ceres in response in large part to the influx of public commitments we've seen in the past few years from companies making pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, largely through greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. And this is definitely the type of progress that we're excited to see. But as more companies publicly commit to reducing their emissions, investors and other key stakeholders are now looking for more evidence that companies aren't just making these commitments, but they have concrete plans in place to achieve them. And this is to avoid, getting to the few years before these target deadlines are due and companies being so, far away from their targets that they need to start scrambling to invest in less cost-effective measures to reduce their emissions or just risk not hitting their targets at all, which would expose them and their investors to a lot of climate-related risks. So in this report, we focus in on the food sector to provide investors with guidance to assess and engage companies on developing and implementing these plans with a lot of sector and sub-industry specific information. And we also provide questions for investors to ask as they assess existing disclosures. And I'd like to note quickly that our intention wasn't to, recreate a whole new disclosure framework for companies to use, but rather indicate areas that investors can kind of look at in existing disclosures to get a better sense of how all these different things companies are already doing might be adding up to getting the company in line with their emissions reductions targets and where existing gaps might be. Next slide, please. And our goal with this report was also to make sure that the recommendations were ambitious and scientifically sound, decision useful for investors, and actionable by companies. And so we consulted all these different folks that you see here on this screen to develop these recommendations. I will note that this report, one of the primary intentions behind it was to guide engagements through Ceres Food Emissions 50 initiative, which you can find out more about on our website. But we still think that these recommendations would be applicable to any investor engaging any food company, whether or not it's on one of the 50 companies on our focus list. But we were able to get 6 food companies from our focus list to provide input into the draft to make sure that the information wasn't just ambitious and decision useful, but that it was within the realm of what companies would be able to implement. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, we really focus in on the food sector on this report. And part of that is because, obviously across sectors, the transition to a lower emissions economy and reducing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels will look very different, especially between, let's say, a steel company and a food company. That transition will look quite different. But even within the same sector, what companies will need to do and how they will be able to achieve emissions reductions will differ pretty largely. And so in this report, we do focus on the 6 sub-industries according to the global industry classification system that are represented by the 50 companies on the Food Emissions 50 focus list. And you can learn more about these different sub-industries in our report, but I do want to highlight some of these industries. So in the green box on this slide, you'll see an example of an emissions profile of an agricultural products company. And we don't intend this to be comprehensive of all the different types of companies in this industry, but we note that there are these different emissions drivers that are quite common throughout any company in the food sector. So commodity-driven deforestation, emissions from fertilizer production, these are all emissions drivers that you would typically see in an emissions profile for any food company. But what is different for some of these companies and some of these industries is where these emissions might appear in an emissions profile or greenhouse gas inventory. For this sub-industry that I've highlighted here, agricultural products, they're more upstream in the supply chain, so they'll have more downstream emissions related to land and agriculture than some other industries. So for example, many food agricultural products companies sell and blend fertilizers, so the use of the fertilizer and the nitrogen emissions associated with the use of fertilizer would be in their downstream emissions. And we highlight these differences, noting that these differences in an emissions profile will then create different risks and opportunities and also leverage points for companies to address emissions. So even if companies are addressing the same types of emissions, the way in which they would reduce those emissions, the suppliers and the customers that they would have to engage in that process will look different. And so you'll find a lot of this type of sub-industry level context in our report. Next slide, please. So really at the heart of the matter, and what I'd like to spend the rest of this presentation talking about are the different ways that companies can develop climate transition plans to ensure that they're ambitious enough to contribute to global goals of limiting temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I note that the rest of the webinar really be focusing on the climate transition strategies and actions, but it's really important that these strategies and actions are based on companies' comprehensive understanding and disclosure of their full scope of emissions. So that's scope 1, direct operational emissions, scope 2, emissions from energy use, and scope 3, indirect supply chain and value chain emissions. And this is really important because without a comprehensive understanding of a company's emissions, it's hard to know if the companies are prioritizing addressing their major sources of emissions. And so if a company is only accounting for and disclosing their scope 1 and 2 emissions, they risk leaving the majority of their emissions. So for the food sector, some companies might see 90% of their emissions as scope 3 emissions. If they're, not accounting for or setting targets to reduce these 90% of their emissions, then they do leave themselves exposed to all of these unaddressed emissions, which puts them and their shareholders at increased climate risk related to things such as impending regulations related to tax on carbon and things of that nature. Similarly, it's really important that companies ground their transition plans in ambitious targets. If a company only has targets to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, or if they're only, setting targets that are aligned with maybe a 2-degree scenario, not a 1.5 degree scenario, in a similar way as with the disclosures, they risk creating plans that may help them reduce emissions, but not enough emissions to align themselves with the 1.5C scenario, which again will expose them and their shareholders with increased climate-related risks. And so for the rest of the webinar, I will be talking about once the companies have robust disclosures and ambitious targets, how they can develop strategies to really get them to where they need to be. Next slide, please. And so in our report, we discuss 4 key areas that companies can look at to really integrate climate action throughout their business. We emphasize over and over again in our report that climate action isn't something that should be siloed within one department, for example, a sustainability department within a company, but that there are ways that companies can really integrate climate action throughout their businesses to ensure that the actions are fully integrated and that they're addressing all the different ways that they have to address these emissions. So we identify 4 areas, and I'm going to talk about the first 3: growth and innovation strategies, procurement strategies, and operations, waste, and transportation in this webinar. And you can read more about the 4th category, customer engagement, in our report. But I will note that this last area is really talking around how companies can, after they implement these 3 other areas, how they can actively engage their customers and, change the way their customers interact with the products that they sell, that, hopefully they've integrated climate action within the development process of those products and services. So next slide, please. So here I'm going to start getting into these 4 areas with a lot of company examples to help illustrate what we mean by some of these recommendations and how, investors can start looking at these disclosures and finding areas where companies can better kind of provide more context and better assess how these different disclosures are adding up to help companies achieve their targets. So the first area that I would like to talk about is the growth and innovation strategy. And by this, we mean all of the forward-looking strategies and plans companies might have to grow their businesses in the future. This often includes processes such as strategic planning, R&D, product development, and capital allocation. And there are ways that companies can think through how they plan to grow their business in the future that integrates climate action at the start. And this will help ensure that companies are not having to address climate-related risks after the fact, but they have a lot of processes in place to help them get them to where they need in a more cost-effective manner. we often see companies start this process through the innovation of new products. We see this a lot right now with the interest in plant-based products. So companies, either those that already have livestock related supply chains and even those that don't, are adding new plant-based products to their product portfolio for the climate related benefits, but also to capitalize on the new and emerging markets related to plant-based and alternative meat products. And this is definitely something that we see a lot of. I pulled out a different kind of example today from Kellogg in their recent CDP report, and them talking about anticipating the need to increase R&D investment into new grains or varieties of crops for improved climate resilience in the long term. And this is kind of a different approach. So it's not just adding a new plant-based product, but it is looking at the types of crops that they might already be procuring and thinking through the long-term climate-related impacts to those commodities and anticipating the need to develop new products that integrate different crops that the company might not already be sourcing or utilizing that might help them create more climate-related resilience in their supply chains and help them adapt to both transitioning to a lower emissions economy and also adapting to a higher temperature climate. And so this is definitely in the space of innovation and R&D that we see companies starting to talk about as it relates to diversifying their product portfolio. But innovating new products alone will not be enough to get companies to where they need to be in order to realign with their emissions reductions targets. And for the food sector as a whole to really create the emissions reductions that are needed to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, companies also need to look within their existing services and their existing portfolios and think through ways that they can reduce the per unit emissions associated with these products so that their overall businesses are transitioning to a lower emissions model, not just through any new products they might be adding to their portfolio. So we see a lot of this, mostly a lot of companies talk about ways they're reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions that I'll talk about later, and really reducing, let's say, the energy related emissions per unit of product that they produce. But as I mentioned, 90% of the emissions in this sector comes from land and agriculture, land-based emissions from agriculture and deforestation in these companies' supply chains. And so it's really important that companies think through ways that they can reduce emissions from those sources per unit of products that they produce or the services that they sell. So one example of this is Yum Brands, which is the parent company of Taco Bell and KFC. They report having a commitment to portfolio diversification, and they talk about this one service renovation that they did at their Taco Bell locations, which is Veggie Mode, which only shows vegetarian options at their self-service kiosks. So that is an example of a way that the company looked at their existing services that they provide for their customers and their existing menu options and thinking through ways that they can increase the prevalence of purchases of the plant-based options as opposed to their non-plant-based options. But from this disclosure alone, it would be hard to tell whether this is having a large impact when it comes to the company's overall greenhouse gas emissions. And so questions investors can ask in ways that companies could improve this disclosure would be through providing more context on how this fits into the overall climate strategy and whether companies have any measures in place to monitor the progress of these. And for this growth and innovation strategy category, it's going to be very important that companies really think through the strategies and investments that they're making and adjusting their strategies as needed so that they're not investing a lot in ineffective or options that are less cost effective than other ways to reduce their emissions. Another way we see companies diversifying their portfolios and really integrating climate action into their forward-looking strategies is through venture capital, as well as mergers and acquisitions. This is a newer space, but we do see a lot of companies starting to acquire different types of companies that will help diversify their portfolios and help reduce their overall emissions. And we also see companies like Tyson reporting on exposing the company to new and innovative ways to make their supply chains more sustainable through, they have a venture capital arm of their company called Tyson New Ventures. So another way companies might expose themselves to new technologies is through venture capital, and then they could, increasingly scale those up and integrate them into their business. Again, from this disclosure alone, it would be hard to say whether or not this is having a large impact. So more disclosures and reporting around, the types of technologies that went from the venture capital space into being integrated into the company would be helpful to get a sense of how all these different investments are helping the company achieve their climate-related goals. And finally, I'll note that capital expenditure alignment and thinking through the different types of infrastructural, manufacturing, and other investments companies might be making in anticipating new growth and new production capacity demands. It's really important that in that process, companies are integrating climate action at the start instead of trying to address those climate-related impacts of the new capital expenditures later on. So one example we've seen of this is Bunge has established a task force to incorporate carbon pricing into their future CapEx planning, which will help them ensure that any capital expenditures they make in the near and long terms will integrate more climate-related criteria. So as I mentioned, a lot of these disclosures are pointing to really interesting ways companies are thinking about their emissions reductions and overall contributing to a lower emissions society. But a lot of these disclosures, as they currently are, make it difficult for investors to ascertain how all of these are fitting into a company's overall strategy and how they might be helping the company get to their emissions reductions target. So next slide, please. So some of the red flags that you might look out for when assessing these types of disclosures is whether the company only talks about efforts that are only affecting a portion of the company's business. If the disclosures are limited to specific types of innovations that might not be addressing the major sources of a company's emissions. For example, we see this a lot with packaging. It's really great that companies are talking about packaging and thinking of ways to reduce emissions related to packaging, but we know that 90% of the company's emissions might not be from packaging, it might be from land-based emissions. So depending on how prevalent some of these emissions are, in addition to innovations in packaging, we would like to see evidence of innovations in other areas that target major sources of emissions. And we also, would like to see evidence that companies are making investments that are really transformative to the company's core business rather than just adding new products to an existing portfolio. Next slide, please. Another area we talk a lot about in the report is procurement strategies and how companies can implement climate action in their supply chains. This is really important. As I said, most of the food companies, the major sources of emissions come from their supply chain. So how companies are engaging their suppliers will be critical to how this sector is able to align with the 1.5 degree scenario. A first step companies often take is by implementing requirements for their suppliers to set their own science-based or otherwise greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. If their suppliers are have goals to reduce their emissions, then it will help the company also achieve their own goals. And so we see examples of that. After asking suppliers to set their own targets, another thing companies could consider doing is assessing their emissions. So not just which emissions are coming from scope 1, 2, and 3, but even within scope 3, emissions from purchased goods and services, doing an assessment of where exactly these emissions are coming from within the supply chain. So are most of the emissions coming from packaging? Are more emissions coming from the food and agriculture supply chains, and if so, which commodities? And this can help companies really target their emissions reductions efforts. So for example, General Mills assesses their emissions and breaks down these different categories, and they found that agriculture represents over half of its total emissions. And then they also disclose, based on that information, how they are engaging their suppliers on implementing regenerative agriculture to try and get at these emissions that, comprise half of their total footprint. And so that's an example of how you would use emissions assessments to inform your strategies to reduce emissions in your supply chain. And finally, it's really important as companies invest in their supply chain emissions reductions efforts that the suppliers that will be responsible for these emissions reductions are properly incentivized. So for this sector, it's really important that even if a company's direct supplier might not be, an agricultural supplier, down the line in the supply chain, there are a lot of farmers in the supply chain. And so an example is ADM investing in a partnership with the Farmer Business Network to develop premium end markets for lower carbon grain. And so that's an example of a way that the company is leveraging partnerships to reduce the emissions of their supply chain. And I apologize if you hear rain in the background. It started raining a lot. So I apologize if the sound is distorted at all. If you move to the next slide, please. And so some of the things to consider as you assess disclosures related to how companies are reducing the emissions in their supply chain, it's important to kind of take a look at whether the company has climate-related policies that only apply to a certain segment of the supply chain. So sometimes companies talk about, oh, we have this policy, but it only applies to, our suppliers of this specific type of commodity. But there's no other information about what the company's policies are in relation to other commodities in their supply chain. Also, sometimes we see disclosures that are limited to certain brands or products or segments and how, suppliers of a certain product are being engaged without a fuller discussion of how all the company's suppliers are being engaged on emissions reductions efforts. We also would like to see companies measuring and evaluating their progress and disclosing this progress so that if companies have invested in some supply chains efforts, but they haven't been fruitful or they haven't been leading to the type of results that they'd like to see, that they're reporting on this and disclosing how they're adjusting their strategies along the way. And again, traceability will be very key for this sector to be able to properly address their supply chain emissions. If you don't know where your products are coming from, you won't be able to engage the suppliers supplying those products. And sometimes we see companies with traceability efforts limiting the disclosure of these efforts to certain commodity suppliers or segments. So similarly, we'd like to see a little bit more comprehensive discussion of how these are integrated throughout the business. Next slide, please. And finally, the last section I want to end on, and I'll try to keep this brief, is operations, waste, and transportation. So as companies reduce their scope 3 emissions, especially those from agriculture and deforestation, the remaining emissions that they'll need to address will come from their scope 1, direct operational emissions, scope 2, energy-related emissions, as well as different types of scope 3 emissions, such as those related to waste disposal, and also if a company doesn't have their own private transportation fleets, any contracted fleets would fall under scope 3 as well. And so there are different ways that companies can address these. And similar to the other areas that I talked about, it's really important to see disclosures that not just talk about, for example, with Mondelez talking about their 100% renewable electricity in certain locations, but a discussion of how the company intends to achieve this for all of their different manufacturing sites. Similarly, for transportation, we see a lot of talks about pilot projects to electrify certain fleets, especially with the heavy duty vehicles. And it would be great to see how companies have plans to scale this up so that it covers a larger portion of their private or contracted fleets. In terms of food loss and waste, we see a lot of companies disclosing information around their waste diversion strategies from landfill. So how companies are intending to reduce the emissions related to food waste by, not diverting, not sending the food waste to landfill. But we also would like to see more examples of companies preventing food waste at the start. So Walmart talks about their goals to achieve zero waste to landfill, and they talk a lot about how they're diverting waste from landfill, but also how they're trying to reduce their operational food loss through methods such as strengthening their forecasting and inventory management so that they're able to anticipate what they'll need to have in stock by enhancing their distribution centers, offering discounts on food close to expiration dates, and other ways that they are trying to reduce the amount of food waste that they can then divert from landfill. Next slide, please. And so similarly, as I've been discussing, it's really important to see companies talking about specific projects that are promising, but also how they intend to scale them up. And it's also important to note that Scope 3 emissions from land-based sources, such as agriculture and deforestation, continue to remain the largest source of emissions. So any companies that only talk about their emissions reductions efforts as it pertains to energy or operations might be missing a lot of different things that they could be doing in their supply chain. So it's one potential red flag to look out for. Next slide, please. So all in all, the report is really intended to help support investor engagements in this sector, and investor engagements can help accelerate transparent transition plan disclosures that will lead to real emissions reductions. And I'm really excited to hear from Matt on how Hershey is sort of grappling with all these different issues. And by providing clear and transparent evidence, companies can not only ensure to their external stakeholders that they're on track to achieve their goals, but also if they're off track, or if they were trying some things, these transparent disclosures can help them kind of reassess their strategies and adjust strategies along the way, and with the intention of having minimal disruption to their own businesses and their shareholders' investment portfolios. Next slide, please. So I know I packed a lot of information into these slides, as I said. Please let me know if you have any questions, but I do want to leave the rest of the time for the Q&A discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Nako, for that very comprehensive and fantastic presentation. I just wanted to be able to highlight within the Q&A, we've had a number of questions about whether the recording will be presented. And yes, indeed, the recording will be sent out to attendees, in addition to the fact that the really information-packed slides that Nako went through will also be sent out to participants. So now let's turn things over to our company Q&A section. And so I want to be able to welcome Matt to the screen. And first, I just want to say that Hershey's is definitely a leader within our Food Emissions 50 benchmark. Hershey's has comprehensive disclosure on Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, in addition to specifically highlighting the emissions that come from land use change into agriculture. So I just want to congratulate you on that. In addition, Hershey's is in the process of developing their, and I think it's the process of having their 1.5 emissions target validated by SBTi, which includes a target to reduce Scope 3 emissions on an absolute basis. So again, congratulations on putting together disclosures and the commitments that you've set aside. But as we've heard from Nako for the last 25 minutes, we're really looking to be able to highlight the fact that this robust disclosure and these commitments need to be followed by implementation plans to be able to meet those commitments. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you about that. But I want to be able to welcome you and give you a chance to be able to introduce yourself. And beyond the great Twizzlers that you have in the background, I wonder if there are any fun facts that you could potentially share with our audience.
Thank you, Julie. And first of all, I just want to thank Ceres for this climate transition plan. It is exactly, I think, what companies need, as we've set targets, but don't necessarily know how to reach them. So this plan helps guide us through that challenging process. So thank you to Ceres, and also thank you to Nako for walking us through the plan. And we look forward to continuing to integrate that into our business. As Julie mentioned, I help lead Hershey's environmental sustainability program. Fun fact about me, I live in a tiny house. So with my wife, we have a 13-year-old daughter as well as a 10-year-old son, all in 388 square feet. So We moved into our tiny house on wheels in March 2019, and little did we know, 1 year later, I'd be working from home and there'd homeschooling all in that small space. So it's been a great fit for our family, and we've enjoyed it. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
That's an amazing fact. So not only are you over delivering at Hershey's, but I can't even imagine. We'll have to have an offline conversation about COVID in a tiny home and homeschooling. But I want to bring us back to the Climate Transition Plan report. And so one of the things that the report does is it highlights the importance of Scope 3 disclosure, not only for investors to be able to understand the footprint of companies, but also for companies to leverage that data in putting together what their climate transition plan would be. So I was hoping that you could speak to the critical nature of having good data to really inform the business decisions when it relates to climate action.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, having good data is critical, and it's something we've worked really hard on at Hershey's. So when I joined Hershey's a little over a year ago, we had an Excel sheet with all our GHG calculations, but there was limited visibility amongst the team. And what we worked on is to increase transparency by creating a climate action dashboard using Power BI. So through that dashboard, team members can go into the tool, slice and dice the data to see what they need to know to be able to help deliver on our goals, and to see where our hotspots are. Also, it's really helped us improve the quality of the data. So before, they would send it to the environmental sustainability manager and they would not know what happened with it. They would not see the numbers. They didn't know how it was calculated. But now, when we reported this last year, we really found a lot of great improvements, because as the commodity managers and other data managers had access to this data, they're able to say, hey, this number has changed. Here's some corrections. We could provide this data in more detail and more specifics. They're engaged in how we're calculating our GHG emissions. So then they're able to give advice and strategies on how we can do better next year, how we could use more supplier-specific emission factors. So increasing visibility, transparency really helped us trust the data a lot more, as well as engage the business in the data and bringing them along to understand what the data means.
That's an excellent example. And I would imagine as part of that, since most of your emissions actually come from your value chain, that you needed to be able to address procurement as part of that. So one of the questions that I have is, how did you engage your suppliers in their own emissions reduction? And if you have any specific examples of that, because I know that that's something that comes up often when we talk to companies.
Yeah, so another critical aspect is supplier engagement. And one of the things that we've been doing is just coming alongside our suppliers and partners and investing together in on-farm solutions or manufacturing solutions. One of my favorite examples is in 2001, we started a partnership with our largest dairy provider, Land O'Lakes, as well as the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay, to create Sustainable Dairy PA, to implement on-farm action in our biggest dairy supplier that includes carbon sequestration, soil health, water quality benefits. And that process, I think through that partnership, we're able to have access to our farmers. So through Land O'Lakes, they introduced us to their farmers. We had conversations to the farmers. Initially, the uptake was slow. So as you may know, like, it takes time for engagement and for one farmer to talk to another farmer, to talk to another farmer in terms of implementing these actions. At first, when we had identified 120 or so farms and there was only about 10 or 15 that had engaged, I said, I was thinking, why can't we accelerate this engagement? But now, after a year later, we now have so many farms where we're trying to keep up with the investment, because it snowballed in terms of those conversations happening between farmers and then becoming more comfortable with, allocating some of their land to riparian areas, implementing best management practices. So just want to encourage everyone that, it takes time, and supplier engagement, and farmer engagement especially is a critical aspect, and just be patient and have the, taking that one step at a time.
One of the things that I love that you said is investing together. And so I imagine that was probably one of the reasons for the success of the program. I don't know whether you want to be able to highlight any other elements that were successful or not successful in terms of the program. A lot of times companies will, kind of give you the overview, but what we really find for companies is that peer-to-peer understanding of what was successful and what wasn't is critical when you're looking at these kind of innovative systems. So do you have any tips in terms of, what was successful and what wasn't successful in the program?
I think a key to success is listening to the farmers and suppliers, understanding what hurdles they have, what concerns they have, understanding and communicating some of the stacked benefits of these programs. Because if you lead with carbon sequestration, that may not resonate with your farmer or supplier. But when you start talking about this is also going to help with soil health, animal health, it's going to help avoid erosion, it's going to improve the stormwater quality of your site, and as well as create biodiversity areas, and just improve overall regenerative agriculture, then you start resonating with them on levels that they care about. So I think it's important to really listen and then engage in what's meaningful to them for buy-in, because it's a lot. If you think of farmers in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, to dedicate land to riparian buffer, that 1 acre may be worth the $500,000, $1 million. So to dedicate that land to riparian buffer is a big commitment. So understanding the hurdles on their side and their concerns, but then come along and saying how it's going to help overall, I think is really important.
That's really helpful. And so I love the idea of stacked benefits, and it makes me think a little bit about, how you measure, the success. Like when you're thinking about this, are you measuring the success just of the carbon or of the other benefits? Just trying to think about how you measure the success of a program like that.
Yeah, right now, since we're still early in the process and some of these initiatives are going to take time for carbon sequestration and benefits, measuring it based on, do we have the right partners in place? Mm-hmm. Do we have the right engagement? Because partners help you do projects faster. They provide the much needed expertise. They also help you achieve much more meaningful outcomes than you could achieve yourself. So understanding, do we have the right pieces in place to scale up these programs, I think is one of the ways I'm measuring it as we wait for some of these benefits and outcomes to take place. The other part is engagement. Do we have engagement in our teams internally, as well as with our partners? Because you do need that culture of sustainability to drive improvement. So it can't just be, one voice, but many working towards the same collective action. Then we're able to achieve much more, achieve greater outcomes. So really been focusing on both that culture of sustainability, having the partnerships in place, and then outcomes will come if you have those in place.
It's really important to talk about, as you just said, the enabling conditions, like within your own organization and then outside of it. But let me switch it up a little bit and talk a little bit more about growth strategy. So Nako, within the presentation, spoke about how you incorporate climate considerations into a growth strategy. So I'm just wondering, within Hershey's, how have you done that? So how have you incorporated that kind of growth strategy and climate strategy together within your processes?
Yeah, great question. This is a very relevant issue and challenge for us at Hershey's because we're growing so fast, and both through organic growth of our own facilities, but also mergers and acquisitions. So one of the things that we've been doing is to preemptively account for growth, which helps us to say, we're on track right now to deliver our targets, but more momentum is needed because we have these types of growth that's going to happen in the future. So we're going to need more reductions. So we've been doing a lot of modeling in order to understand what the future scenario looks like and to understand that growth so that we have it aligned with our business plans and climate action strategy.
And I think that's great in terms of preemptively accounting for growth, because I think that that's something that it's not only about what you're doing today, but it's about where your company will be in the future and how to be able to meet that. Have you done anything in terms of renovating existing products, or in terms of M&A process or mergers and acquisition process that you'd be able to share with the participants?
Yeah, so with regards to that, we mainly been modeling those opportunities and then saying if we need to implement these types of actions to reach our goals. So while mergers and acquisitions are new to us, but we are integrating them into our business plan and trying to bring them on board as soon as possible so that we can have those benefits from the start, as Nako mentioned earlier.
Great. So let me change it up one more time. I'm just looking at as the time, and you and I had an earlier discussion on how to kind of operationalize this and bring this into operating plans or a long-term strategic planning process so that it doesn't, it's not individually siloed. I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit more in terms of how you've done that at Hershey's. I'm sure other companies and investors would be interested in hearing more.
Yeah, so what we're doing is to align our climate strategy with our business strategy, I think, which is really important because these things, as I mentioned earlier, take time. And we're going through project-based design and development, scoping, and then you have to pilot some of these programs. Before you know it, it's 2025 and you're needing to scale up and you have 5 years, So I think it's important with the alignment. One of the ways that we are aligning is through individual and collective climate action strategy. So individual plans for cocoa, dairy, sugar, manufacturing, and then a collective kind of how are we collectively meeting this goal. So that's one of the ways that we've been preparing and aligning the business.
Great. And so you did mention this a little bit, but one of the things that we talk about is scenario analysis in terms of climate scenario analysis, and how that can be a useful way within a company to be able to bring other players within the company into the strategy process. I don't know if you can give us any insights into whether you've used scenario planning, and if so, what the kind of results were within the organization.
Yeah, I've learned so much about climate scenario planning the last 6 months. It's been an adventure, but one of my favorite parts about it is we started with interviews with thought leaders in the company, like our executive team, board member, and as well as like at facilities and different facilities, especially along the tropics that are feeling climate change a little bit more, to understand different climate related risks and opportunities. And it was I think an amazing engagement experience because one, I learned a lot from their perspectives, but I could also see they were learning a lot as well. Just like, oh, I've never thought of this. Because as you know, with the business strategy, the time horizons are usually like looking at more near future, not 10 years from now, 20, 15 or 15, 20. So it was a really great way to engage them. Then we took those results, we created a climate survey, and then we surveyed our external and internal stakeholders to understand what is the time horizon of when these impacts are going to occur and the magnitude of the impact. The survey results was like very soon, very high, kind of a lot of, especially the acute issues that we're feeling now. But then we're also modeling this in a new tool. So to understand in financial terms, what are these impacts looking like in terms of decreased yields due to drought conditions versus in different scenarios. And that's been really good too, to validate as well as be able to share and not only these are going to happen, but be able to say these are going to happen, and this is the million-dollar impact, multi-million-dollar impact of this. So really helps, I think, bring it all together. Like I said, still learning a lot in this space, but it's been something that I think is helping prepare the business for the future.
So it seems like for your scenario analysis that you did, that it wasn't just a small group of people in the room. Can you give us an idea of how many people you actually reached out to as part of this, and maybe even how many people like actually are part of the dashboard? Like, I think that it's great to be able to contextualize that for people.
Yeah, great question. So for the interviews, we probably had about 15, 20 people. We did 10 interviews, but multiple people in some of those interviews. And then for the climate survey, we sent it out to over 230 stakeholders, and we got about 92 responses, which is really good for a survey. So that we had good engagement there. And then for the climate action dashboard, it's available to internal employees. And we are really focusing on bringing more awareness of the dashboard, getting their feedback on how they want to see the data, what's most helpful to them. So we are like continuing to like push the dashboard and say, hey, it's here, this is an available tool to you, and improve the dashboard based on their feedback as well.
Excellent. So I want to be able to kind of, I guess, give you a little bit more of a floor in terms of just kind of going through what are the key barriers and challenges that you foresee for companies as they implement their climate transition plans. So just in general, you've been a part of developing the report, and I think we can say that. And I would really love to be able to hear what you think of as the biggest barriers and challenges, but then also the opportunities.
Yeah, so the biggest barrier for me is the uncertainty. So we have changing guidance, especially in the land use sector, and quickly evolving space, and also a lot of work in the unknown. So keeping momentum, moving forward in the midst of uncertainty, and also in the midst of a heavy workload. I think all those in this space are feeling that right now, and trying to keep. We love the work and trying to keep up with the work, but all the uncertainties are also bringing a lot of questions. How are we going to do this? And so we're trying to keep that momentum going in the midst of that. Also, there's a lot of change management needed. So in order to meet our climate goals, it's not just a little tweaks here and there. It's changing the business and making significant change to how we do things. So that takes time, that takes a lot of strategy. And so I think that's also one of the hurdles.
So, decision-making under uncertainty is always something, but I think that you talked about two different kinds of uncertainty. One is the uncertainty in terms of the data that is coming in, and the other is kind of the uncertainty in terms of what it means for your business. So I guess that, how have you gone about with that uncertainty being able to get internal buy-in? And it might be through the climate scenario analysis that you've walked about, but I think that it's something that a lot of us face, and how to be able to help people feel comfortable with decision-making under the uncertainty.
Yeah, so for us, this is, I think, something we're doing well. And this is something I'd encourage all those participants to, moving forward in the midst of uncertainty, because if you wait till you have all the knowns, it's likely too late. As well as, a lot of these projects like tree planting, there's exponentially more benefits if you plant trees now than if you wait to 2025, 2026. Those trees, sequester carbon at much slower rate when they're small. So moving forward with that uncertainty. The second I would say is I lost my train of thought real quick. Yeah, I'll come back to it though, but yeah. So.
No worries. So in terms of the opportunity side, as you kind of look at opportunities within the marketplace. How much of that is there a conversation right now at Hershey's about the kind of opportunities that this provides for, really being able to understand your supply chain, getting to know your farmers, getting onto the same page with them? I'm just wondering if there's any discussion about the opportunities, such as you outlined within the Land O'Lakes project, that you have to really get to know your supply chain and those circumstances more.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been focusing on in understanding those opportunities and also lowering the risks of moving forward with unknown is having a holistic strategy by focusing on opportunities that have stacked benefits. So we can say, we're moving forward with this project for the carbon sequestration, but also it's going to help water quality, it's going to help improve yields, it's going to do, so then there's, the management and leadership's feels more comfortable with it because it's aligned to maybe our social impact strategy as well. So drawing those connections to mitigate the risk and to show that we're not this project has multiple benefits.
Thank you very much. That was a great answer to that question. So I guess the final question I have is a fun one. So we see in the background that you have Twizzlers in the background. So I'm wondering what other rooms that you actually have at Hershey's. Is there a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup one that would speak to my heart, or is it just a one-off room?
So we have rooms throughout the building, a lot of fun designs with all of our different Hershey products. And then you'll find in almost all of our meeting rooms a bowl of candy. So for everyone to grab some candy, as well as Skinny Pop popcorn and mints and other all of our brands. So lots of fun rooms here at Hershey, as well as tasty treats.
Yes, it would be a dangerous place for me to work, I would have to say. So, Matt, I just want to be able to thank you for spending the time with us today. A fantastic conversation that got into in depth in terms of the way that a leader is trying to be able to tackle these issues. So I just wanted to be able to thank you for participating.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity and for the conversation as well.
Great. And so I am looking in the live Q&A, and I just want to warn you, there are certain people who might reach out to you regarding tiny home living during COVID. So that has definitely come up within the Q&A. But I want to be able to thank all the participants for participating in the Climate Transition Plan webinar today. And please feel free to be able to reach out to Ceres. I think we have in the chat, if I'm correct, information on the Food Emissions 50 initiative. And on the report that we put together. And again, the webinar materials will be coming out to everyone who participated. So thank you very much.